So I'm going to be very brief, and I'm going to try to organize my thoughts on autocratization that I have observed in Brazil lately, right? So despite the return to democracy in 2023 in Brazil, I think Brazilians are still haunted by the far right. So that's a big problem here. But now what I want to talk to you is that Brazil is now the target of what I'm calling this transnational autocratic lawfare that is promoted by the United States, I think. And I have two examples to give to you. I think the first example is that Brazil is now the subject of this investigation, trade investigation, informal investigation, based on a Trade Act of 1974. And now the United States is accusing Brazil of doing what they are calling these unfair and discriminatory practices. So in 6 fronts. So being one of them, illegal deforestation. So apparently Donald Trump is worried about the environment, but in Brazil. The second example, it's going to be the 50% tariffs on Brazilians, I think, Brazilian product, and that the motivation here is important. He said that Brazil is doing a witch hunt against our former president, Jair Bolsonaro, because we have the trial of the former president, Jair Bolsonaro. So I think the two examples, the formal investigation and the 50% tariffs, they are quite important for us to understand what the meaning of this transnational autocratic lawfare. So he's using domestic and international law. He's twisting the concept of international human rights law in order to advance his geopolitical agenda. So that would be the first problem here. But what he's getting, he's weakening Brazilian democracy. So I think that's the objective. But to be sure, I think the escalation against Brazil has 3 reasons. I think the first reason would be Brazilian foreign policy. So Brazil has this proud and active foreign policy. So it's a proud member of the BRICS, and it's moving away from this automatic alignment with the West. So this is the big reason. This is the first reason, I think. The second reason would be because Donald Trump represents the interests of big tech companies, and now Brazil wants to limit the reach of this power, of their power. And the third reason is because now Donald Trump wants to have this transnational cooperation with far-right movements, and Jair Bolsonaro represents that, right? And also, he wants to erode multilateral cooperation. But now, let me introduce you someone who is quite important, a key actor in the latest developments in Brazil, and that's Justice Alexandre de Moraes from our Supreme Court. He's also a professor at my university, University of São Paulo. And the Supreme Court was quite important here because they expanded their powers in latest years. Actually, what they are doing from the outside, they were trying to promote and preserve democracy. So from the outside, I think what they are trying to do, they are using this militant democracy toolbox, right? So we could say that. So militant democracy would come to solve the dilemma of democracy, that they would have to protect the rights of authoritarian regimes, even if they want to destroy democracy. So let me give you 2 examples of the decisions of Justice Alexandre de Moraes. And one of them is he was promoted as the sheriff of the internet, and at a certain point he decided to block users of X, the former Twitter, because they were spreading lies and they were spreading hate speech and attacking democracy. And that angered a lot the far right, but that was also angered Elon Musk, that you can see there. So Elon Musk said, I'm not going to comply with your decisions, and you are a dictator, you should be imprisoned, you are controlling the free speech in Brazil. So what did Alexandre de Moraes do? He actually blocked X for 200 million people in Brazil. And then what happened was that Elon Musk backed down, and then he decided to comply with his decisions. So actually, the Supreme Court won this battle. So that's the first one. So you can see that democracy or Moraes. So for the left, who saved the Brazilian democracy was the Supreme Court. But for the right, who saved actually, it's the Supreme Court itself that is the threat to democracy. So you can see the problems with narratives here. The second decision, of course, it's because Alexandre de Moraes is presiding over the trial of Jair Bolsonaro that could lead him in jail up to 43 years. And one of the reasons is that because after Lula won the presidency in 2022, there were millions of supporters of Jair Bolsonaro who stormed Brasilia and invaded government buildings. So they promoted destruction and demanded a coup. I just brought some pictures for you here of the destruction. And yes, so he could end up in jail because he masterminded the coup. And actually what happened is that Trump now wants to save Bolsonaro from jail time. And he said that he imposed the Magnitsky sanctions on Alexandre de Moraes. And the sanctions is very tough. It only happens with human rights violators, and that's clearly not the case of Alexandre de Moraes. So I think the US Secretary said that Moraes would be responsible for an oppressive campaign of censorship, arbitrary detentions that violate human rights, and politicized persecution, so including against the former president, Jair Bolsonaro. So I don't have a real conclusion for the events, the facts that I have here. Only this transnational autocratic law firm seems to be a new way how to bold the agenda of these new autocrats that want to remain in power. So they are using domestic and international law, and especially twisting the concepts of international human rights law and freedom of speech. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the presentation about Brazil. It's really interesting. Yeah, I will try to focus on a couple of minutes on Romania elections, especially because we have at the border a huge war, and it was again on the focus 2 days ago with the high-level meeting. And then I would also want to focus on the situation and the link between autocratization and civil society. So I will start by saying that, of course, Romania offers a striking case. In March 2025, the Economist Intelligence Unit downgraded Romania to the category of hybrid regime, and we are the only EU country to fall so low. The report cited the controversial annulment of the 2024 presidential elections and the erosion of institutional checks on executive and security power. This is not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a decade-long trend where state institutions, including intelligence and policing structures, have been captured by pseudo-elites lacking democratic culture. Romania's trajectory illustrates how constitutionalism can be undermined through legalism, and how courts and civil society become the last line of defense. And of course, the clearest illustration is the annulment of the 2024 presidential elections that most of you probably heard about. In December, the Constitutional Court declared the first round void, citing obscure intelligence reports of alleged Russian interference. The explanation was unclear, the evidence weak, and the legal reasoning unconvincing. On paper, the court acted within its authority. In substance, the nullified the popular vote on political grounds. The Democracy Index marked this as the turning point in Romania's collapse into a hybrid regime. Here, legalism was weaponized to override constitutional values of electoral fairness and political representation. The second example about Romania, which might looks like far away, but it's not, and the phenomenon is not new. Valentin Câmpeanu, an orphan raised in a state-run orphanage, was a young Roma man, HIV positive, with an intellectual disability. I found him on behalf of the Center for Legal Resources only a few hours before his death during an unannounced visit to a psychiatric hospital where over 100 people had already died from hunger and cold. The Romanian state argued at that moment the CLR did not have locus standi to act on his behalf. This would have completely excluded the possibility for the abuses to be judged, a classic example of legalism used to shrink civil space. The European Court of Human Rights rejected this approach and held that in exceptional circumstances, an NGO may represent a deceased person without family in order to prevent rights from becoming theoretical and illusory. Valentin was moved between institutions without a clear diagnosis, without consent, and ended up in a hospital notorious for lack of resources. After his death, prosecutors' investigations were superficial, medical files were incomplete, and doctors were not held accountable. I think this is a form of legalized impunity, using procedures to close cases and maintain, the status quo. The European Court of Human Rights found that the problem was not an isolated case, but a structural pattern, the lack of representation for institutionalized adults with disabilities and the absence of genuine legal safeguards. 10 years after these days, European Court landmark judgment, and we are still calling on the responsible ministries to recognize by law the right to carry out unannounced visits to these places and to represent children, elderly, and adults with disabilities. But about this, we will speak tomorrow at the Mindful Justice session. A more recent illustration comes from environmental litigation in Bucharest. Civil associations challenge permits for large real estate projects, and now I'm thinking again Brazil, invoking urbanism, environmental and heritage concerns. In retaliation, the developer group One, some huge in Romania, sued these NGOs as well as individual activists, including the current Romanian president, at that moment the mayor of Bucharest, for damages exceeding 1.5 million euro. The tribunal and the Court of Appeal rejected the claims, holding that expressions like predatory developers and suffocating projects were within the bounds of free speech and civil action on matters of public interest. Had the developers succeeded, the chilling effect on civic participation would have been immense. Once again, we see how legal avenues were used to suppress rights and how independent courts play a corrective role. And the last example is the case of Sfurială versus Romania from less than a year ago that illustrates legalism at the street level. The applicant was withdrawing money from an ATM machine when police demanded his identification. He objected that he had done nothing unlawful, nor obstructed traffic by his car. Nevertheless, he was forcibly taken to the police station, beaten, and detained for hours. Authorities justified the incident as a routine identity check, in line with domestic law. Strasbourg disagreed. Romania violated Article 3, prohibition of ill treatment, and Article 5, right to liberty. The court stressed the applicant's identity could have been verified immediately, including to police radio systems, and that his 2.5-hour detention was arbitrary. What's the relevance for autocratization? This case shows how police supremacy relies on a culture of impunity, shielded by appeals to the letter of the law. Legalism becomes a tool of authoritarian legitimation. The citizen is reduced to an object of state control, while national institutions, prosecutor courts fail to protect rights. And in this case, it was only the European Court of Human Rights that restored the constitutional meaning of law. In conclusion, taking together these examples reveal a consistent pattern: the erosion of substantive constitutionalism through the overextension of formal legalism. Whether through the annulment of elections, the exclusion of NGO from standing, abusive lawsuits against civil activists, or arbitrary police practices, Romanian institutions have too often privileged procedure over principle, legality over legitimacy. The lesson is clear: democracy is not sustained by legal reform alone. It requires institutions committed to constitutional values, vigilant civil society, and when national remedies fail, supranational protection through the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Siri, for inviting me for the Bergen Exchanges, Lara, and Matea, Martha, the entire team of LawTransform for putting together these really wonderful intellectual and social exchanges, and to my co-panelists for their presentations. So 25% of the world's population lives in South Asia, and so I have to speak about that for 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, I'll try my best. The first half of 2025 has been quite despairing for democracy and regional stability in South Asia, which consists of 7 countries, but 23% of the population actually lives in 3 countries. India is the giant with 18% of the world's population, and 5% of the population lives in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so I'm going to speak about these 3. Significant democratic gains made in 2024 in India and Bangladesh are beginning to fizzle out. Pakistan, of course, has been on an increasing autocratization track. It had seen sham elections in 2024 following installation of a puppet regime by the military. It has faced further autocratization as it has continued to keep in jail Imran Khan, the leader of the previously lawfully elected government, and arrested nearly 200 people of his party when they organized to protest the continued incarceration of Imran Khan. In India, the unexpected loss of electoral majority of the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, in the general elections that were held about a year ago had led to hopes of revival of democracy following increasing autocratization over the last decade that had led to India being downgraded from a democracy to an electoral autocracy by the Wiedemann Institute in 2021. However, continuing police and tax raids, investigations and arrests of opposition leaders, dilution of human rights legislation, assault on independence of the press, judiciary, NGOs, cartoonists, comedians, by the government, which is now in a coalition at the center. And speaking of digital authoritarianism, we recently passed a new income tax amendment law, which is going to allow the income tax authorities to access all of our WhatsApp messages in order to figure out tax evasion. So, right? All of this alongside the fact that even though they lost their electoral majority in the general election, the BJP actually won 3 out of 4 state elections that have been held since last year. All of these pointed to increasing autocratic consolidation. In Bangladesh, where a student movement had overthrown the repressive and autocratic regime of Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League and forced her to flee the country in 2024 and installed an interim government led by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus and had promised democratic and political reforms. Unfortunately, we have seen an increase in the rise of religious extremism, sectarian violence, attacks on minorities, Hindu, Buddhist, and even Muslim minorities, and arrests of over 20,000 Awami League members, and the banning of the Awami League, and the failure to hold democratic elections more than a year later, which is causing increasing tensions between the interim government and the military. On top of all this, in April, a brutal terror attack, the worst in decades, targeting Hindus in Pahalgam in the state of Kashmir, where 26 civilian tourists were massacred by terrorists who had links to Pakistan, and the decades-long history of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in India, the Indian government took unprecedented measures, including suspending its obligations under the Indus Waters Treaty. The Indus or Sindhu River Basin, from which India derives its name, Indus, India, consists of 5 eastern and western rivers that flow from India to Pakistan and provide most of the drinking water and irrigation supply for Pakistan and northern India. India said that now it will build structures to dam the river and prevent its flow. In May, the Indian Air Force targeted terrorists and terror infrastructure in Pakistan. Pakistan retaliated, which led to war that lasted for 4 days, following which a ceasefire was negotiated. Although India and Pakistan have a history of armed conflict, this is the first war since 1971, which had led to the creation of the state of Bangladesh, wherein conflict was not limited to border areas or the state of Kashmir, and where the Air Force was involved in such a serious way. We must remember both are nuclear-armed nations. Last week, even as both countries celebrated their 79th Independence Day from British rule, Pakistan's military dictator, General Munir, threatened nuclear annihilation if Pakistan faced any kind of existential threat. And of course, the right to water is an existential threat. Meanwhile, the Indian Prime Minister responded by saying that India will be self-reliant in its defense and economy and not succumb or tolerate nuclear blackmail. This was a message both to General Munir and President Trump, who, of course, has caused world instability, and he has recently imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods. It is clear that this conflict between India and Pakistan is far from over and has led to renewed autocratization efforts in India, with censorship followed by arrest of any criticism of Operation Sindoor, the name for India's operation against Pakistan. India-Pakistan independence also marks the 79th anniversary of the bloody partition that initially divided the two countries on religious grounds, the denouement of centuries-old colonial legacy of British rule. So I do want to think about war and colonial legacies when we think about autocratization. Though both countries were secular democracies to begin with, Pakistan quickly descended into an ethnocratic Islamic republic and has faced successive military dictatorships with multiple constitutions over the last 79 years. India remained independent and democratic and secular, but for a brief period of authoritarian rule in the 70s and now. Prime Minister Modi's Independence Day speech also mentioned for the first time in 12 years the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh as the world's largest NGO. Turning 100 in a few days, the goal of the RSS, which is the ideological parent of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, is propagation of Hindutva and creation of an undivided India and ultimately a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation like the Islamic Republic in Pakistan. Various legislation passed by the BJP-led government over the past decade, like the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, are attempts to remake India in the form of a Hindu nation, which is different from the secular republic that India was conceived to be at the time of independence. What is happening now is similar to the idea that led to the recognition of Israel as a democratic Jewish state. Israel is the inspiration for the new idea of India, as indeed it was the inspiration for the idea of Pakistan, which led to its fall from an originally secular to an increasingly ethno-nationalist, religious nationalist state. And that is the next question I would pose to all of you, is it ever possible for a religious state to be a liberal democracy? In line with this, over the last 10 years, we saw rewriting of Indian history, deletion of history of the Mughals, Muslim rulers who ruled India for more than 400 years, and overplaying the legacy of the Hindu kings who were defeated by the Mughals. Similarly, we are seeing deletion of chapters on democracy and civil society from textbooks. We are seeing ultranationalism and personifying the cult of the leader into the nation. This can be seen from the fact that last year, the Prime Minister Modi inaugurated a temple to Lord Ram, the deity of Hindus, built on a site where the Babri Mosque, constructed by the Mughal king Babur, was demolished. And we have places being renamed all over the country. Efforts are also now ongoing to subvert the electoral process. These have occurred incrementally over the last decade. First, the dilution of the Right to Information Act, amongst dilution of many progressive human rights legislation, including environmental laws, restricting the information that had to be readily furnished by government functionaries in response to requests from the public. Then, by the enactment in 2023 of the Chief Election Commission and other election commissioners law, which left the appointment of the Election Commission completely in the hands of the central government. Overturning a Supreme Court verdict on the issue that had sought to also provide a check on the executive power by saying that the committee must also include a Supreme Court judge. And now finally, with the special intensive revision exercise being done by the Election Commission for upcoming state elections in the state of Bihar. The state of Bihar is the second most populous state in India. It is also one of the poorest. Touted by the opposition and civil society as the largest disenfranchisement exercise in world history, this exercise has already led to the deletion of 6.5 million voters from the voter records. A majority of these voters are women, a significant number of whom have been declared dead, while many of them were recently found to be having tea with the opposition leader. And that was the opposition's attempt to show the futility of this exercise and the danger of it. Enormously cumbersome, the process requires people to prove both their identity and citizenship through not so commonly available documents. The opposition first challenged the process in the Supreme Court, and then about a week ago, the leader of the opposition, Rahul Gandhi, did a press conference where he highlighted voter discrepancies of 100,000 in one assembly constituency in the state of Karnataka that would have changed the outcome of that election in favor of his party. The Congress is in power in the state of Karnataka, so they were able to access the data, but the data, so much digitalization, but the Election Commission hasn't even made the data public, right? The Election Commission responded to the complaints in a cavalier fashion. The ruling BJP jumped to the Election Commission's defense with a bizarre conference where they highlighted similar issues in other constituencies where outcomes would have gone in their favor, thereby highlighting the issue of electoral discrepancies, right? So Gandhi and 300 opposition MPs attempted to march to the Election Commission office and were detained by police in news reports that were splashed all over the world. Stung by the salience of these allegations and the coordinated opposition campaign to emphasize vote theft by the Election Commission, the Election Commission did a press conference yesterday, even as the Supreme Court has given interim orders to release the list of the 6.5 million voters that have been deleted in the state of Bihar as part of the special intensive revision. Therefore, and I will conclude with this, identity and citizenship are crucial to this episode for the battle for democracy in India. Digital initiatives promoted over the last decades, notably Aadhaar, which is the world's largest identity project where all Indians have been issued or are in the process of being issued an identity card. So these digital initiatives that were touted as important for the poor because these identity documents were said to be necessary for provision of welfare subsidies and for financial inclusion were not being accepted for purpose of proving citizenship and voting rights. The burden of proof that has always rested with the government for disenfranchisement of someone who is in the voter record has now, as we see, been shifted to the citizen. Even as the ruling party seeks to consolidate autocratic power and its ideological parent persists with its imagination of creating a Hindu nation. The Constitution is center stage in the battle for resistance, as are strategies of Gandhian Satyagraha, truth and non-violence in peaceful protests against autocratization. As a united opposition mobilizes media that is coming out of institutional capture and a fairly independent Supreme Court that is trying to help citizens understand and secure their voting rights. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to the whole LawTransform team. It's an honor to start off this day. And it takes so many people to bring these programs together. And every year I come, I'm just touched by the meaningful conversations that happen. And I think the community that gets built, and that I guess I'm just going to say, as we continue to talk about autocratization, it's exactly these communities, when we talk about resistance, et cetera, it's all happening here. So that's always very exciting, very hopeful. And so I'm going to try to keep that attitude as I move through my 10 minutes here. I would be remiss to assume that no one knows what's going on in the U.S., right? And I think I put up this first slide just to clip some of the early on headlines that took place when Donald Trump came into office, or won the elections and then came into office, and as we started watching, and as the whole world started watching and feeling directly the implications of this person in office, and very much that swing towards autocratization very strongly, very swiftly, with a kind of speed and velocity that although folks were very prepared for this in some ways, I think still surprised everyone. And so I think some of these are, this kind of boss of everyone and everything, and this changing the world order with unprecedented speed was really, very real. And I actually had to include that image there of, I don't know if this kind of got all over social media, this little pin he wears on his lapel, which is actually a sort of caricature of him. And in some ways, he's a caricature of that autocrat, which is it's not funny, like maybe caricatures are supposed to be funny, but amazing how he was almost following a textbook of what you would assume an autocrat and someone moving into power quickly and what they would attempt to do. And so I think as I thought about this panel, and I want to have you all, return to your programs, because I sort of, in some ways, I love the organizing questions. So I just want to repeat them again. This thinking about how repressive narratives gain legitimacy, and then also what role does law play in advancing authoritarianism and strategies of resistance. And I think what's interesting in this case, maybe I want to point out after the speed and the velocity to which these efforts took place to really disrupt the U.S. government in every sort of office and form, and then widespread, whether it is sports, culture, colleges, all of those institutions in the United States also becoming touched by these executive orders that had very real impacts. You also started to see if these, these other kind of, the one big beautiful bill act sparks debate and pushback is almost, again, starts to be a legitimacy crisis. And so I put up this data, which is actually from August, of just showing, this first question, how do repressive narratives gain legitimacy? I'm not sure they have gained legitimacy. And so it becomes an interesting question how they move forward without legitimacy. And how long does that last? We're still so soon in, right? This is 6 months, whatever, in. And approval ratings are extremely low. The 6-month in job approval rating is 38%, which isn't even up there. But these are just measuring public opinion regarding this tariff policy, which, again, everyone is feeling that. And then also the kind of big, beautiful bill. And so this is very real, I thought, just to have us keep thinking in our minds about how, yes, it took some supposed some agreeing on the legitimacy to have gained power, but once in power, how this can move along without legitimacy. It's really that second question that I want to, certainly if anyone's then been following, this is the time for those law and court scholars to really say, wow, let's watch this play out in the courts. And it really has. So I think lawyers on both sides, that many people talk about the Trump 2.0 was coming in with lawyers who were already ready to go in terms of dismantling so many parts of the U.S. government, and also then these implications on the global economy, et cetera. But at the same time, the opposition, the resistance, was also very much lawyering up. And so we see this playing out in court. It will continue to play out in courts, which is in so many, So in many ways, those of us who study law and courts, and in the United States, where we see these very multi-levels of courts in which claims can be coming, it becomes a fascinating thing to watch. So this is just some statistics on, by August of, a few days ago of kind of what cases have been the kind of back and forth. I think what I'd like to really spend this second chunk on is something I can bring to this conversation to move us away from, again, I don't think you need a rundown on everything that's been happening in the, kind of at the federal level. But so I'm at the University of Washington. That's in Washington State, not Washington, D.C., right? That northwest corner of the United States. And it brings a very interesting perspective, actually, when we think about, I'm thinking if Dan was here from Texas or Bruce from Florida, they would have, again, a different experience of what's happened in the last 6 months. And so I just wanted to point out, especially this law and strategies of resistance, and in the way in which Washington State has very strategically prepared for this and is not letting up. And so this goes back to Trump 1.0, again, in his first administration. Our Washington State Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, who I might say is actually an alumni of our political science department, which has been exciting to reconnect with him. But we were the first state to sue on constitutionality of, and I hate to even bring it up again because it's such a horrible thing in American history, is this Muslim ban that Trump immediately put into place, which targeted sort of 7 Muslim majority countries and banning those coming in from those countries. Bob Ferguson, you know, he was the first state to move in that did actually immediately halt then that ban. It went back and forth, and Trump then, you know, kept, et cetera. You know that story. But anyhow, there was that history already there of no, we're not standing for this. What was interesting even in that case is you saw really lots of activity from civil society. So non-governmental organizations like the Northwest Immigrant Project or the ACLU of Washington were very active. So you saw civil society working alongside government officials to push back on the Trump administration. In Trump 2.0, Bob Ferguson is actually now our governor, so he has become governor of the state in that time. And our new Attorney General, Nick Brown, has just jumped straight in same way. So there's a wonderful website that you can, it's a tracker that it points out some of these cases that have come already. They're not all successes, but again, it's this idea of using law as a strategy for resistance. It doesn't mean you're always going to win, but it certainly is an attempt to really strategically use the courts to bring into question what Trump is putting forward and the constitutionality of it. Some of the cases, everything from the birthright citizenship case, which many of you might have heard about, overhauling elections. The Washington state has always been on the forefront actually of using mail-in voting because of its accessibility, has been supported both by Republicans and Democrats in our states. And so that was attacked in some ways and trying to you know, you could only count mail-in ballots if they came in before the election. And again, Nick Brown was very quick to push back on this. Another one I thought was a good example too. So some of these are being brought, again, by our state attorney general, but cases are being brought from those same, again, these non-governmental organizations in Washington states have continued to build the community and the networks that it takes to use law as a strategy of resistance. And so they've continued to work together to do that. There was a case on when the federal government began canceling all sorts of community justice types of grants that these organizations really depended on in order to help programs for youth, et cetera. The Center for Children and Youth Justice and other NGOs came together to file lawsuits. So it's really, I think, a positive story of not, you know, not settling, but instead continuing to try to resist and using law and courts to do so. I guess I wanted to sort of end with a quote here from Nick Brown, because I think it's maybe a call somewhat to our own conversation that can take place during this week. But when it was in an interview about this kind of, you know, the quickness to which he swiftly moved in and helped orchestrate some of this litigation, and then also in losing some of these. But we will not give up. We will continue to fight. It's incumbent on all of us to not capitulate in this moment, to not accept these changes that we're seeing from the president, and to continue to use every tool that we have available to challenge these unconstitutional orders. So again, it's just this call to not settle and to think strategically and to resist. So I'm just going to end on that note.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you, Siri, for the kind introduction, which ups the expectations. But to say, I mean, the nice thing about really going last after this fantastic panelist is that I can say, as my fellow panelists said, and that's it. But yes, but again, many thanks for having me. It's always great to be back at home in Bergen and the Bergen Exchanges, which has been really great. As Siri said, I think I come into this space with my own, well, the second doctoral research that I did at the University of Washington, really interested in looking at the role of law, especially in semi-competitive regimes in Africa. And so with a case study of the Gambia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda. And so disclaimer again, I'm gonna do broad strokes. I do have friends and colleagues in the room who are doing fantastic work, and I know that they are in the following panels, in the next couple of panels, and will be going more in depth into some of these issues as well. But I think just to start maybe with, and there are a lot of I think overlapping threads with the earlier interventions by my fellow panelists, but to say as well, I think, when we talk about Africa currently, the African context currently, I am from West Africa, so especially in the Sahel, obviously there is a whole lot of conversation about the resurgence of coups d'etats, which I'll talk a little bit about. But as everybody said, I think one of the things that obviously we've seen, and which is the central crux of this conversation, is really the weaponization of law. And so as we think about strategies and autocratic lawfare, that it is subtle, right? It's not, not necessarily just the coup d'etats, but that we are seeing it obviously through the laws that we have in our various countries as well. So I just wanted to, 10 minutes is not a long time, and I can talk the whole day. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things in three different areas. I think one is that as we talk about democratic backsliding in the various regional contexts, but also in Africa as well, that what we know is that it's hiding, obviously, some of it is hiding behind both legal as well as constitutional maneuvers. So from the constitutional replacement projects that we've seen, for instance, in Togo last year, where, for instance, with the changes that were made, the current incumbent can be in power as long as possible. And we've seen that in various African countries, but also similarly in Chad as well, with the constitutional amendment in which the current incumbent also is now extending decades-long his decade-long family rule as well in those contexts, and very much similar to what we've seen in other places as well. But I think of interest on my side as well is that obviously beyond the constitutional changes, we know that African leaders have systematically used legislation to silence dissent. And so my activism background obviously comes in here. And I think it's interesting because currently what we've also seen as well is this whole, we can say facade of concern about hate speech in various African countries. And I can give a quick example of the Gambia. So as some of you know, the Gambia was under a dictatorship for 22 years. We are still in a transition from an autocratic rule to a democratic one, and dealing with the laws the repressive laws that were passed during that time, as well as the major barrier we face, considering that now twice we failed to have a new constitution. Hopefully we'll get there someday. But I think most interestingly as well is that earlier this year, the criminal code that was actually inherited from the British in the 1930s, very similar to a lot of African countries, was still in place, obviously with amendments that were made over the past 22 years. With this replacement, it's interesting because in a democratic order, obviously you'll think that we should have a law that is better, right? Some of it is better, but we also maintain the sedition laws as well as the others. But so the replacement, so we have a new criminal code of 2025, and one of the first prosecutions that was actually made was against a woman who was arrested and brought to court for insulting the president in a car. And so in the current new dispensation, democratic rule, and in the new act as well, we do have obviously a very controversial provision that punishes people if they insult the president, the vice president, ministers, members of National Assembly, and so. Gambia historically, but a lot of African countries as well, we know that there has been a history in which obviously these laws are used to silence dissent, to silence journalists, but also obviously leading to self-censorship as well. I wouldn't say a lot about the media, but we know that obviously with the increase of licensing fees, but also the use of state-owned, controlled media, we know that propaganda, especially for the incumbent, continues to be seen in various African countries as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Sahel because I think it's interesting, and especially when we think about resistance, but the politics of resistance. And this is, I'm going to draw a little bit from very early work that I've been doing with Wesley, who's looking at me because I owe him some work. But to say as well, and this is just a quick recap or overview for folks that might not know, but in West Africa, especially in parts of what we call the Sahel, there has been a resurgence of coup d'etats, and particularly of interest is what we've seen in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, especially with the withdrawal from ECOWAS. So ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. And so I think part of the narrative, and we've spoken about this before in the exchanges, part of the narrative is really around this idea that the military juntas, obviously, and the coup d'etats are happening as a way of resistance to foreign influence, but also against the corrupt elites as well. And so with these two countries, they actually withdrew from ECOWAS, and which officially began this year, earlier this year as well. And so I think what we see, obviously, is that the lack of accountability in various African countries obviously serves as a great, as a space, as a ripe space, obviously, for what we see with the coup d'etats. But I think for me, most personally, of interest is one of the recent major development that we've seen. So as a result of the withdrawal from ECOWAS, we've also recently seen the ECOWAS Court of Justice actually issued a decision stating that all cases related to these three countries will now be withdrawn, even those that were filed before the withdrawal and those that were even heard before the withdrawal as well. And I think this is interesting because as we think about courts as contested sites, what we're also seeing as well is that due to the fact that the military juntas and these countries are able to withdraw alongside, taking power away from victims who have been waiting for decades for justice, that it is going to serve as a discretionary space where the potentiality for ripple effect, obviously, there is possibility for that, because it's really showing that if states have the power to withdraw at ease, especially in terms of putting aside their human rights obligations, then it can serve as a signal, especially for other countries that are currently undergoing coup d'etats as well. And so I just wanted to wrap up with just this idea around not just law, and to say as well, especially with the court-centered approach, and this is a plug, both Siri and Lisa had a fantastic paper on Third World Quarterly around pro-democratic actors and how they engage in various countries, including Kenya, as well as Malawi and other countries. But I also wanted to highlight, I think, when we think about law as resistance, very recently, again, in Gambia, through the Public Order Act, which is a colonial era law that we still have in various African countries, where obviously the constitutional right to protest is now a privilege because you have to have permission in order for a public gathering. But what is interesting in the case of the Gambia is that recently with the Gambians Against Looted Assets is that during the Jammeh regime, there has been a commission and the assets were sold. And due to the lack of transparency and investigative report, Gambians came out to protest, and due to the fact that they didn't have permission, they were arrested, right? But I think what is interesting as well is just this idea that even though the law was repressive, they were arrested, but it also served as a ripple effect in the sense that with that sort of amplified attention, the National Assembly, Parliament, currently has a parliamentary inquiry looking into the lack of transparency and the processes for the sale of the forfeited goods as well. So I think as we think about strategies, it's also to say that what we should be thinking about is how civil society, how ordinary activists, but also legal scholars and lawyers can really strategically engage with the law in terms of holding governments accountable, obviously knowing that now it's not just stuff in the box, obviously, that ship has sailed, but that African governments are in very subtle ways, obviously using the laws to entrench power in ways that do not align with the democratic ideas and values that we all party to or adhere to and so forth. So I'll pause here and say thank you again.
The same way.
Okay, so lots of questions on Alexandre de Moraes. Why is he so powerful like that? And why did he take the brunt? I think that was Tanya's question, and that's about the institutional design of Brazil, but that's about a personal preference of Alexandre de Moraes. So in 2019, he was given a specific process to preside over, the fake news ones, and then he was assigned each case of concerning Jair Bolsonaro. So that's why he took that leadership. But I have to say also that he was approved by plenary sessions, so it was not only him. But I think because of these two decisions that I gave it to you, the internet one and because of Elon Musk, so they had this row between Twitter, then he became quite famous and he angered the far right, but it was also because he's presiding over the trial of President Jair Bolsonaro. So I think that was really specific. And as I told you, the left thinks that they saved Brazilian democracy, and the right would think that they are the threat to democracy. So that's what happened right now. And I think I think there was a question also of BRICS and why is Lula talking and being very autonomous. That was always his foreign policy, the proud and active foreign policy. He has to talk with everyone. He angered so many by saying that Venezuela should be included in conversations. So that's why also that angered the United States. And I think when I look at COP30, the environmental problem that we have in Brazil, these I think strengthening of BRICS is also very important to make some kind of front, unified front to United States that's bullying these other countries. So I think in foreign policy, that would be the main target. And I would stop here. I think I have to remember more questions, and then maybe I'll answer more. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for those very interesting questions. I first will respond to the point about that Tom raised about Tom and Livia about legislators and then about courts. So and about subnational legislatures and executive. And of course, not only are we seeing, it's really interesting because federalism in India has been both a check to autocratization from the center, but at the same time, at the subnational level, the leadership of some of the subnational governments have been even more autocratic. So, for example, and this is one of the things that, as our Prime Minister reaches his birthday milestone of 75, which is when he coined the rule that people should retire, many people are asking after him who, and one of the worrying things is whether it would be the UP Chief Minister, who is seen to be Yogi Adityanath, who is seen to be way more autocratic than Modi. So, of course, we have autocratization, and it's not just from the ruling BJP, it's also from other parties. Basically, what we have seen is that a culture of autocratization has become normal, and that is the worrying factor, because regional parties are doing the same in governments where they are in power, and it's just really hollowing out of democratic procedures and legitimacy. So it is very worrying. I think the Supreme Court in India and the High Courts, which are also constitutional courts, have played a very important role. And as you know, in your own research has shown that the Supreme Court's record on free speech case is actually not as bad as it is touted to be, even during this period, but also in terms of other cases. The problem is there has been such an aggressive assault against the courts by the government. So for example, on the Election Commission appointment, the court gave a judgment that was trying to fix that, but the government reversed it through a law. On federalism, because the governor from the center was impeding state laws, the Supreme Court said, well, he can't hold off laws forever. He has to decide within 3 months. The government is now attacking that. So every time the Supreme Court has tried to preserve something, there has been backlash. On the appointment of judges, there has been backlash. So, and that is the question we need to think about, is that even if courts want to do things, what are their limits? Because if the majoritarian parliament then still comes back with something, what can they do? Thank you.
Thank you, Namita. Do you want to go now, Georgiana? You can wait. Yeah.
I was just thinking at the debate around the Constitutional Court and legislators in Romania linked to the elections from December last year. And there were a lot of rumors around this because First of all, it's the debate around politicians that designate judges at the Constitutional Court in Romania. And this was in the same time with, again, a huge scandal that was related to the involvement of intelligence services with politicians, high-level politicians, in discussing before the election about the potential success of a politician in one of the main political parties in Romania in the election in December. So after this private discussion that was held in some kind of I know, a villa in Bucharest with the former Romanian president and others. They were gathered by the chief of the intelligence service in Romania. There were all of this discussion. Then, what's the involvement of the Constitutional Court? How they will deal with this? Because they were before of this discussion with the election and the involvement of digital autocratization and TikTok and everything around the election. There were a lot of other subjects that should be on the table of the Constitutional Court, and they didn't. So I don't know what to say about the involvement and the role of legislators in Romania, because what we are seeing these days actually is the result of 20 years of erosion of civil society and involvement of journalists. I will close by saying that I can feel now it was more easily to ask for public information 20 years or 10 years ago than it is these days, and we can see this.
And that is very interesting. I think that is that's something that also Namita mentioned, but sort of the way in which information and facts are being weaponized in many different ways. Rachel.
These are the great questions. Let me just touch on a few, and I think this is interesting. So the role of legislators is, and clearly in the United States, so much attention has gone to the federal level and what's going on there. But again, I welcome the opportunity to share that Washington state perspective, because it's actually stood out quite uniquely as the Democrats have across the board became stronger. I mean, many states, even if they stayed strong and were already a sort of blue state, they lost some points in terms of the Democratic Party. But in Washington state, there was sort of 9 key leadership positions that were all remained Democrat. Conservative ballot measures have actually failed. And it's an interesting state because certainly in the urban area and the Seattle area, yes, very progressive, very Democrat, but not the whole state necessarily, right? There's many rural areas and which have traditionally been Republican. But so that's again, there's an interesting dynamic going on there at the state level, certainly for legislators, and also just to point out this. Again, much attention has gone to the U.S. Supreme Court when we think about these apex courts and their role. But I think, what's interesting, so something like the birthright citizenship case, in which they didn't really touch the constitutionality question, and, in many ways was kind of a loss or, which was not surprising in terms of who's sitting on the court and the way those it ended up in the end. But I thought what was quite interesting with it, though, too, it very much still protected. So, Washington State, which had, and states who had sued were, again, injunctions held then. And so that was kind of a success in terms of that resistance. And then also, I thought what was interesting in the which was included in the decision, was saying that anyone affected could seek a class action suit, right? Statewide, region-wide, or nationwide. And so there was, some essence of a kind of win for the resistance that then encourages more use of the courts. So those are just 2 examples or responses I wanted to give. But great questions.
Thank you. Satang.
Sure. I'll be quick. I think two quick things. I think one is just on the use on accountability mechanisms. So particularly based on the other work that I do around the African human rights system, I think what we also see very similar to what I already highlighted with ECOWAS is that in certain cases, obviously we've seen progress with pro-democratic actors being able to go to the constitutional courts or the Supreme Courts in their countries, obviously, to ensure results are annulled or hold government accountable. But in most cases, we then look at the sub-regional courts like ECOWAS, but we've also seen, obviously, a backlash with the SADC courts. And then regionally, obviously, with the African Court on Human and People's Rights and then the other mechanisms. But what we're increasingly seeing, obviously, is the sort of drawback on, the power of these accountability mechanisms, especially by African leaders and the political organs usually sits in Addis Ababa. So I think as we think about how courts can support in relation to this, I think what we're also increasingly seeing is obviously the pushback by states as well. This is not, I think, something that was already mentioned, but I think on the question of legislators, I think part of the question that we should be asking or focusing on as well is state of emergencies. We've seen a lot of that, especially in the African context during COVID, but currently ongoing in El Salvador. We've seen a little bit in DC in terms of what we're currently seeing as well. So I think the role of legislators is also very vital in terms of how governments can use that to encroach on gains made as well. But I'll pause here for the other questions.
So that's excellent, and I think some of these issues we're coming back to, but I think that sort of the weakening of or realignment or whatever, but the challenge of the international governance structures that we're seeing now in the African context, but also more generally, is also something that is important to keep with us, and that we'll come back to. The good thing is that these questions that we're discussing now are going to be with us for the week. So we'll come back to them. I'm now going to start with Satang and end with Daniele. So please, you can go first.
Sure. I mean, I was kind of waiting to go last. But no, I think I just wanted to perhaps take the question, which I think I highlighted in my earlier intervention around the politics of resistance. And I think as we think about resistance, we should also be very mindful, especially with the resurgence of coups, that the military leaders that we've seen, obviously, around the concept of popularism, have some sort of popular support, right? Because they do speak to the concerns of ordinary citizens as well. And obviously, on the other side, the drawback, as I already highlighted, is really the sort of backlash and the rollback that we've seen with regard to accountability mechanisms and so forth. So how we think about what does resistance look like and for who, I think is very relevant. And just on the last point, as a scholar activist, and I think there was a question about the utility of research, is really been very mindful because not this space. I think this space is fantastic in terms of how we engage, provide a platform for scholars, practitioners, but I think as sometimes traditional academia, obviously, we do our book chapters, our books and journal articles, and it's all fine and great. But if it doesn't really filter to the everyday people and the work that they do, then it becomes problematic, right? So I think really as we think about the scholarship that we do relevant in these times, is also both in terms of working with, and I know this might not be a popular idea, but in certain instances, we do need experts in this room to work with government structures, right? To work with the opposition, to work with civil society. I mean, I do that, and I think there is relevance there to think more creatively in terms of how we engage in these processes.
Thank you, Satang.
Great, thank you. These are all great questions, and I just would encourage, I'd look forward to chatting with any of you more about them, but it's interesting. I wanted to give some credence and direct response to this call for thinking about making our research accessible, because this is something in particular that has come under attack specifically in the next 6 months in a very grave way in the United States. So these very much however small or big a university is, but these college campuses and the faculty on them and the students on them have so much been, kind of put under the spotlight and the crunch of, really freedom of expression violations and really having to, watching. And this decision of, maybe you always had this idea that you wanted to make your research accessible and people having to make these decisions about scraping websites or not. And again, I have felt very lucky to be at a university that has, stood very strongly on and has, quite a few research agendas that engage with issues of, say, diversity and inclusion, et cetera. And so they have not, promoted going about scraping websites. But I think that is very important, and that call is on more than ever. And we've seen the same thing with federal grant agencies being shut down. And I do think the pushback and that resistance is really important too. So I think finding community members that you can connect with so that you keep making that a goal of your research to make it accessible and not, and not fear that threat that comes with that.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Namita.
Thank you. Thank you for all those wonderful questions. One question from the last round was about, international relations, geopolitics. I do think that geoeconomics as well as geopolitics is the driving force behind many of these partnerships. And even as Trump is remaking the world economy, there are many unintended consequences. So the fact is that the US 50% tariffs on India are actually pushing India closer to China, which may not be a bad thing because they are all both nuclear armed nations perpetually on the brink of war, etc. But I think it is up to us, and that relates to the second question, which is what more can we do, is that we can come together through the mechanisms that are provided through these international corporations to forge the partnerships and exchanges to actually consolidate that. The horror movie, so, it's true.
In 10 seconds.
Yeah, it's true that, the thing about horror movies is that it involves resurrection of ghosts. And the entire point of my presentation was to say that many of these issues resonate from the 1920s. The RSS is a 100-year-old organization. The debates and discourses that led to the creation, Israel was created at the same time as India and Pakistan. So these ideas were on the table then, and they have remained kind of submerged and are rising again. So it is up to us to make sure that secularism remains as much as democracy.
Thank you, Namita. Very good. Georgiana.
Yeah, I will just want to refer to the question related to perfect case law from European Court of Human Rights and the role of the perfect law. And I think this is the future of political changes that we see, at least in Romania, probably. As you might know, usually European Court of Human Rights decisions come with individual and general measures, and with general measures you have to improve or change the law. So Romanian legislators and actually Romanian government is really good at this, because usually they will promote a law with small changes, and then they will say, oh, but these important safeguards will come with a secondary piece of legislation that is never coming. So, yeah, this is how it is.
Thank you. Thank you. And then
Super fast, because there is overtime here. So I think I didn't respond to the questions about militant democracy and when should the Supreme Court stop. So is it overreaching? And I think I'm not really fair to say that they are using the militant democracy toolbox. Maybe they are, but there is a crime there that you cannot threaten democracy in Brazil. But actually the problem is our legislative that Livia mentioned, and that we don't have it because it is the legacy of autocracy. So it's because of that they are overreaching, and right now we need them. And with the question of federalism, I think that was really important in Brazil during the time of COVID-19, that they presented a resistance to to Bolsonaro and his policies against COVID-19. So that's it. Thank you very much.
wow, thank you.